The date was December 7, 1941. The United States entered the war after Japan attacked American forces at Pearl Harbor. The war had truly become a world war. In April 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army took control of the Philippines from the American forces stationed there. But the Japanese Army was weak. When the U.S. launched a counter-invasion of the island nation in early 1944, they began to retreat. By the end of 1944, most Japanese troops had been removed from the larger islands of the Philippines and sent to the smaller Philippine archipelago. Things began to go very badly for Japan. Its economy was struggling, and its armies, spread across half of Asia, were becoming difficult to manage. One by one, the territories they had won in the Pacific fell to the American forces. Hiro Onoda, the hero of our story, would be sent to one of these islands. The island was called Lubang. It was of volcanic origin and covered with dense jungle. Hiro Onoda, a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army, had joined the army at the age of 18. After completing his basic training, he attended Nakano Military School, where he specialized in guerrilla warfare for 2 years. He also studied philosophy, history, martial arts, propaganda, and covert operations. But the most fundamental lesson Onoda learned at school was this: under no circumstances will you willingly give up your own life. On December 26, 1944, Japanese soldiers landed in 4-man teams on the small island of Lubang in the Philippines. Both his commander and Onoda knew this would be a challenging mission. It was time for the young lieutenant, who was only 22 years old when he entered the war, to put his training into practice. He would lead the soldiers in his squad and never give up. The teams that landed on Lubang Island were ordered by their commanders to stop the invasion of American troops as much as possible. To do this, they were to destroy the Lubang airfield and the pier adjacent to the harbor, as well as enemy planes and crews attempting to land. They would buy the Imperial Japanese Army time to regroup and prepare to attack. In the meantime, they would fight to the death, never surrendering. The last words Onoda and his subordinates heard from their commander were, "I forbid you to die. The war may last 3 or 5 years. No matter how long it lasts, you will survive and wage guerrilla warfare. No suicide. If you have to eat coconuts to survive, eat them. We'll come back for you in the end. You, Lieutenant Onoda, will lead even if you have only 1 soldier left. Don't expect any reward. Fight with honor for your homeland." In February 1945, American troops arrived on this rainforest-covered island, 25 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. The U.S. Navy bombarded the island with heavy artillery for hours. Most of the Japanese soldiers were killed or captured. But Onoda and his 3 subordinates managed to escape into the jungle. Here, they began a guerrilla war. Onoda was determined to carry out the training he had received in military school and to obey his orders to the end. So he and his men shot every American soldier they could find, attacked supply lines, set fires, and, in short, did whatever they could. 5 months passed. Onoda and his subordinates survived in the wilderness, eating bananas, insects, reptiles, coconuts, and whatever they could find. Sometimes the fruits they gathered, and sometimes the rice and animals they stole from the natives. In August 1945, America made a serious decision and chose the fastest way to end the war. It dropped the atomic bombs it had developed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This move really ended the war. Japan surrendered. The bloodiest and deadliest war in human history ended. But for some, the war was not over, and it looked like it would not be over for a long time. World War II was finally over, but thousands of Japanese soldiers were scattered across the Pacific Islands, hiding in forests like Onoda. Unaware that the war was over, they continued to fight. After the war, as East Asia licked its wounds and borders were redrawn, the continued fighting of these thousands of soldiers became a serious problem. The governments had to do something. So the US Army and the Japanese government decided to drop flyers from the air over the Pacific. The flyers read, "The war ended on September 2nd and everyone went home. Get off the mountains." Onoda and his subordinates found the flyers in October 1945, but Onoda, who had also studied propaganda in military school, decided it was a trap. The American soldiers must have come up with such a clever way to reveal the guerrillas' whereabouts. He was determined not to fall into this simple trap. He tore up the flyer and continued to hide and fight with his men. The struggle for survival in harsh conditions lasted 4 years. The 4 soldiers found ways to survive in the wilderness and continue the war. But one of Onoda's men, Private Yuichi Akatsu, decided to leave the others in September 1949, thinking that the war might actually be over. After 6 months on his own, he surrendered to Philippine forces. Onoda and 2 other friends thought Akatsu had been captured and killed. This meant danger for them. Now that one of their friends had been captured, they had to be more careful. So they decided to keep moving and maximize their secrecy. A few more years passed. The people of Lubang Island lived an everyday life of farming and fishing. But as had been the case for years, life was sometimes a nightmare for the locals. Hiro Onoda and his loyal soldiers were still fighting, shooting at the farmers, burning their crops, stealing their livestock, and killing anyone who ventured too far into the jungle. The desperate Philippine government contacted the Japanese government in 1952 based on information received from the surrendered Akatsu. So, new flyers were printed, but this time with a personal note from the emperor and a photo of the families of the missing soldiers. Notes were written and photos were printed. Then it was distributed by plane. But Onoda thought that his family lived under occupation and had to obey the enemy to survive. The war must have been raging in the area where Lubang Island is located because the number of planes flying over it constantly increased. This was probably a new method of deception on the part of the Americans for the Japanese soldiers in the area. Thus, despite the other side's efforts, Onoda once again concluded that these flyers were fake. Onoda, who had a very traditional sense of pride, could not imagine that the Japanese would surrender. To him, Japan was a country with the character to fight to the last soldier. Besides, it would be shameful for a Japanese soldier to leave his post without orders. So, the 3 soldiers continued to fight. A few more years passed. The Filipino people were fed up, and the casualties were mounting. The people took up arms and began returning fire. In June 1953, one of Onoda's men, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, was shot in the leg during a skirmish with local fishermen. But he did not die because Onoda, a skilled soldier, managed to treat his friend's wound, albeit with primitive methods. But his efforts were in vain. On May 7, 1954, Shimada was shot again by the people of the Philippines. This time, he was not as lucky as before and lost his life. Onoda and his last comrade, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, were deeply saddened by the loss of their friend, but it forced them to be even more cautious. Now there were only 2 of them, and the circle was getting tighter and tighter. Onoda and Kozuka were so used to living in nature that it was as if this way of life was the only thing they had done since they were born. Years passed, and it was 1972. For 27 years, these 2 loyal soldiers had fought for their country. In reality, the war was over long ago. In the meantime, the world had changed and changed a lot. In 1947, the transistor, the basic building block of electronic devices, was invented. In 1955, the long war in Vietnam began. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built in Germany. In 1964, the first Olympic Games were held in Tokyo. And in 1969, America went to the moon. Technology had advanced, and Onoda's country was recovering from its wounds. The world was becoming increasingly globalized, but this globalization could not take these 2 strange men under its wing. For them, the world was still in World War II. Finally, Onoda's last friend, Kinshichi Kozuka, was hit by bullets. On October 19, 1972, he was killed by 2 shots fired by the police while burning a rice field, exactly 28 years after he joined the war. Onoda was alone now. His last companion, with whom he had spent more than half his life, had died, and the pain of this was overwhelming. The pain of living a life of loneliness and uncertainty was indescribable. The days did not pass. For 28 years, this soldier had shown unparalleled obedience in the Lubang jungle and was still fighting alone. But with one difference: he was not facing enemy soldiers, but civilians and local police. When the news of Kazuka's death reached Japan, people were confused. The Japanese government had declared Kazuka and Onoda dead years before, in 1959. Of course, there were no bodies, but it was unlikely that they had survived all these years. So, the news began to appear in the Japanese media. Since Kazuka was in Lubang until 1972, Onoda might still be alive. There might even be other soldiers still alive. The same year, the Japanese and Philippine governments sent search teams. Their goal was to find the ghost soldier and end the story, but they found no one. As the months passed, Lieutenant Onoda's story spread throughout Japan and became an urban legend. A war hero who may or may not be alive. But it was certain that if he did turn up one day, he would be a hero to his country because a soldier with such a high sense of duty had earned everyone's respect. The psychology behind Onoda's behavior stems from one of the ancient Japanese teachings, Bushido. This philosophy, which means the way of the warrior, had no room for fear. To be a samurai was to be a person who had conquered the fear of death. The Bushido philosophy taught a set of moral principles such as loyalty, self-control, courage, kindness, and honor. Although the samurai class was abolished by Emperor Meiji in 1876, the Bushido philosophy was still alive. Onoda was born into a family that embraced this philosophy, and it was this system of values that sustained him all these years. From that point on, Onoda's story seemed to have a predictable ending, but this unprecedented event would become even more interesting. A young man would set out to find Onoda. While Onoda, the ghost war hero, was the talk of his country and the world, a young man named Norio Suzuki was hearing Onoda's story for the first time. Suzuki was adventurous, eccentric, a bit of a hippie, but a man who loved to explore new places. Born after the war, he had dropped out of school and spent 4 years hitchhiking across Asia, the Middle East and Africa. It was unclear where he slept. A free-spirited and crazy young man, he sometimes worked on farms to feed himself and sometimes sold his blood to pay for a place to stay. But that was not enough for him. He needed another adventure. He simply had to be on the road and his own. The legend of Hiro Onoda was definitely a story worth following. Perhaps he would be the one to find him. The Japanese, Philippine, and American governments and local police had been searching the forest for nearly 30 years. Thousands of flyers had been dropped from the air with no response. Could this adventurous hippie really find him? This was complete nonsense. There had been repeated attempts to lure Onoda out of his hiding place, but all had failed. Still, it was worth a try for Suzuki. After all, what did he have to lose? His life was going in circles. Arriving at Lubang Island on February 16, 1974, Suzuki's strategy was simple. Alone, he would call out Onoda's name and tell him that the Emperor was worried about him. He carried out his plan and, incredible as it may seem, found Onoda within 4 days. He looked him in the face and bowed slightly. When he saw the other man pointing his rifle at him, he bowed again. His hands and knees trembled so much that he almost fell to the ground. "Are you Onoda-san?" he asked. "Yes," said Onoda. "I am." "Really?" Suzuki continued. "Lieutenant Onoda?" "Yes, I am. I know you had a long and difficult time. The war ended in September 1945. Wouldn't you like to come back to Japan with me?" Suzuki realized that what he was doing was actually very dangerous. Onoda could have seen Suzuki as a threat and ended his life on the spot. But Suzuki had a significant advantage over his predecessors. Because he was looking for Onoda alone, Onoda did not feel threatened. Once Suzuki had convinced him that no one else was lurking nearby, he thought it was safe to talk to this intruder. In the future, he would write in his book, "I could have shot him if he hadn't been wearing socks. Even though he was wearing sandals, he had thick wool socks on his feet. Islanders would never do something so inappropriate." Suzuki's use of polite Japanese phrases calmed Onoda and made him realize that the young man in front of him had indeed been raised in Japan. But at the same time, he seemed to be in a hurry. It would not be easy to convince a soldier who believed he had been at war all these years. "No," he said, "I'm not going back. The war is not over for me yet." Suzuki realized that this determined soldier would not give up easily. Onoda was not an ordinary soldier. He had been trained in a special school for commandos. After 30 years in the jungle, his rifle was still shiny and functional. He fought the enemy as best he could, did not hide, and was not afraid to die. He also looked much healthier and fitter than the average Japanese of his age. He was not like the other soldiers who hid in fear of death and surrendered in misery years after the war. So Suzuki decided to take things slowly. He would spend the night with him. Onoda had been alone for a long time. It had been 2 years since his last friend had died. So, he welcomed Suzuki's company, and he could learn what was happening in the outside world from a Japanese source he could trust. Suzuki asked him, "Why did you keep fighting even though the war was over?" Onoda was very clear when he replied, "Because I was ordered never to surrender. I was ordered to fight even if I was the last soldier alive." He was still obeying the order that he had been given 29 years earlier. At one point in their conversation, Suzuki asked Onoda how he had survived all these years in the jungle. Onoda began to explain. He said that he had been with his friends for most of this 30-year adventure, and they had supported each other. Once he was alone, he said. It became tough. Years later, in an interview with the Japan Times, he will say, "If you have thorns in your back, someone must remove them. Humans cannot live completely alone for very long. If you have doubts about this, imagine you are alone. You cannot take care of yourself if you are sick or injured. You cannot find food, make a fire, or sew your own clothes. With someone by your side, you can endure anything. The real struggle begins when we are alone." Onoda's greatest challenge was the loss of his friends, true dat. But Suzuki was still curious how even a few people could meet their hunger and shelter needs for decades in the jungle. He kept asking. Onoda said they were most concerned about food, water, and hygiene. He explained that they lived on bananas, coconuts, and beef, and sometimes stole what they needed from the locals. Bananas were the staple food of Onoda and his friends. They would boil them with their peels in coconut milk. This softened the bitterness of the green banana peels, which they couldn't afford to waste. It didn't taste good, but it was what they ate most of the time. They would also steal some cattle from the villagers every year. After shredding the meat, they would cook it for 10 days to produce hundreds of pieces of dried meat, consumed throughout the year. They were as fussy about water as they were about food. The tropical island of Lubang had many streams. Although the water from these streams was very clear, they always boiled the water to avoid diseases that could be transmitted by microorganisms. Toilets were another problem. They would dig a toilet pit next to their makeshift houses made of trees. When the pit filled up, they covered it with dirt and leaves and continued to defecate in it. They used palm leaves for toilet paper. Onoda examined his feces every day and adjusted his diet and physical exertion accordingly. There was also the question of personal hygiene. They would wash their faces and even take showers every day. They would shave with scissors and knives they found. They even took the time to brush their teeth with palm tree fiber. But what they cared about most was their weapons and ammunition, which enabled them to carry out their primary mission. They would take meticulous care of their rifles and ensure they were maintained. They would never waste ammunition. They had also built weapons depots at various points around the island. The next day, no matter how much Suzuki insisted, Onoda said he would not surrender unless he received an official order from a senior officer. So Suzuki made him a promise. He would find Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had assigned him to this mission, and bring him here. He asked Onoda's permission to take a photo as proof of their meeting. Then he returned to Japan. Suzuki was incredibly lucky and quickly found Onoda's commander by following the trail of his military career. When he found him, he was retired and running a bookstore. Suzuki then informed Onoda's brother. Together they went to Lubang Island to meet Onoda on March 9, 1974. It was as if the Japanese commander was fulfilling his promise in 1944. At that time he had said to Onoda, "Soldier, no matter what happens, we will come back for you." This motivational phrase, spoken to a soldier sent on an impossible mission, was founding meaning and coming true exactly 30 years later. When Taniguchi arrived at Onoda's side, Onoda immediately recognized his aging commander and saluted him. Onoda was shocked and could not hold back his tears. His clothes in tatters, the soldier still approached his mission as if it were his first day. Taniguchi gave the order. "By order of the Imperial Army Command, the 14th District Army has ceased all combat activities. Soldier, the war is over. Lay down your arm." Onoda surrendered his sword, his Type 99 Arisaka rifle, which was still functional, 500 rounds of ammunition, several grenades, and the dagger his mother had given him in 1944 to kill himself if captured. He even presented his sword to the President of the Philippines himself. The local press captured these incredible moments and immortalized Onoda's story. Onoda answered those who asked him why he hadn't given up all this time as follows. "One must have a sense of citizenship. For 30 years I served my country every minute of every day, never thinking whether it was good or bad for me as an individual." Over 30 years, Onoda and his subordinates had killed 30 innocent people and wounded 100 more. Some of them were civilians, and some were local police. Of course, Onoda was aware that the people he had been killing all these years were not American soldiers, but since the war was not over, they were the enemy, even if they were Philippine police. Now he realized this was not true and was overwhelmed with sadness. Besides, this could have led to his prosecution. Nevertheless, President Marcos pardoned Onoda, recognizing that he believed the war was ongoing. When Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, 30 years after 1944, he was famous. A crowd of 8,000 people greeted him. His family, who believed him dead, saw him for the first time since he was 22, and this historic moment was broadcast live on NHK, the country's national broadcaster. Many radio and television stations lined up to interview him. Onoda was 52 years old and had spent more than half of his life fighting in the jungle. First, he was examined by doctors and found to be in unbelievably good health. It was as if he was proving to all humanity that nature is man's true home. After all, he had lived a physically active life in the forest for years, eating a completely organic diet. During his first months in the country, Onoda felt as if he had been transported in a time machine to a world 30 years in the future. Everything had changed. Technology had advanced to unimaginable levels. His country was industrialized. People were working in factories and offices. He now had to adapt to this new world. Some even got him jobs. Conservative politicians wanted him to enter politics, but Onoda refused the offer. He also refused to accept his 30-year lump sum salary from the government. He did not accept the donations that people collected for him and used them all for charity. His goal was not money or fame. He just wanted to fulfill his duty to his homeland. Well-spoken and strangely calm in front of the cameras, this former jungle man presented himself as a man of calm and honesty, not aggression and imperialism. That's why he won everyone's support. By popular demand, he wrote an autobiography about his life, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, which became an instant bestseller. But when Onoda returned to Japan, he was not happy with what he saw. There was a consumer culture, a capitalist world order, people dressed in Western clothes, and a new generation that had lost its ancestral tradition of honor and sacrifice. None of this appealed to Onoda. He wanted to use his fame to revive the traditional Japanese values of courage, loyalty, pride, and devotion that had dominated wartime society. But no one wanted to hear his voice in this new, changed society. So Onoda fell into an even greater misery than the decades of fighting in the jungle. He fell into a deep depression. He moved in with his brother in a Japanese community in Brazil. Here, he eked out a living as a farmer. Perhaps this traveling young man, Suzuki, should never have found him. For Onoda, living there, in the jungle, had a meaning, a purpose. But now, there was no trace of the Japan he had lived and fought for. In 1984, while living in Brazil, Onoda was read about a Japanese teenager who murdered his family and deeply moved. He was so moved that he decided to return to Japan and restore the ancient Japanese morality that had been corrupted. So, he founded the Onoda Nature School training camp. He taught his students the skills he used to survive while hiding in the Philippines for 30 years. He believed that these skills would empower them and increase their self-confidence. He believed that this philosophy would make the children he trained better people. Onoda died of natural causes on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91. Although 10 years have passed since his death, his story is still as vivid as the first day. In 2021, French director Arthur Harari made a movie in his name. Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, is an adventure drama movie inspired by Onoda's life. A novel telling his story was published the same year. Werner Herzog, a German film director, wrote a novel called The Twilight World, which tells Onoda's story in great detail. It is unbelievable that a man could carry such a sense of duty for 30 years. Perhaps Onoda knew long ago that the war was over, but he didn't want to accept it. Perhaps he had difficulty imagining what kind of life he would have in the post-war world. But ultimately, he wrote the most interesting story in war history. You are all familiar with the famous psychologist Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Onoda had what Maslow categorized as basic needs, such as food, shelter, safety, and health. In a way, he also had the third level of the pyramid, which is love and belonging. Kozuka gave him a sense of companionship and security that satisfied his psychological needs for most of his life. What about meaning? People cannot live without meaning. We all have something that gives meaning to our lives. For some of us, it may be religion, starting a family, starting a business, or producing something that benefits humanity. So, what was it that gave meaning to Onoda's life? To complete his mission perfectly, yes, what made Onoda's life meaningful was ensuring that his homeland won the war in which it was engaged and carrying out the orders of his commander, so that one day, when he returns to his country, he can walk the streets in honor. It's what keeps us all alive, meaning. None of us needs a title, luxuries, or a big house, because even though we have so many tools to live with, we are finished if we don't have a purpose to live for. We need a life that meets our basic needs, people we love, and a purpose that gives meaning to our lives. That's it. As Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how."